Today we're going to talk about the CSC RX4 rear shock absorber. Obviously CSC imports motorcycles from Zhongshan, a Chinese manufacturer, and their high-end brand is called the Cyclone. So this bike's sold as a Cyclone RX4 in different Asian markets, etc. Here it's a CSC RX4. Overall, pretty neat bikes at a very reasonable price point, but certainly there's a few things that you can fix to make it better, the shock being one of them. Most people find that the shock is way too stiff. I purchased two of these, one for myself, one for my wife. Neither of us can get the shock to sag, even with us sitting on the bike. Zero rider sag. So what you really want is roughly 1/3 of the travel with your rider sag and about 1/3 of that free sag, so non-rider sag. We're unable to get any of that with the stock spring. So I measured the stock spring rate. The stock spring rate's a progressive spring. It's a roughly a 500 pound, 700 pound per inch progressive. So that, for those in the metric system, that's an 88 Newton per millimeter, and goes to 122 Newton per millimeter spring. So an extremely stiff spring for a bike that weighs 450 pounds. I did disassemble the shock. My nitrogen was only charged to 80 psi. The owner's manual says it should be at 150 psi. I went ahead and disassembled the shock, mapped all of the valving in the shock, both compression and rebound. The shock itself is fairly simplistic. It doesn't have a high-speed damping circuit on it. It uses one piston with shims on each side for the complete compression and rebound system. It does have an adjustable rebound clicker on it, which also will have some effect on the compression damping, but the internals of the shock looked okay. Certainly not up to European standards, but not bad for the application. Okay, so let's get into the shock. The stock spring, it measures out in length to 237 millimeters. So you have a preload adjuster and a locking ring on it. Just back those off, slip this clip down, and you can slip the spring right off. This rubber bumper will probably be at the top like this. Your shock sits in this position in your motorcycle, so just slide that out of the way as well. So I had a couple of special springs made. They're 350 pound per inch springs. They're a little bit shorter. They're about 220 millimeters in length. But we have plenty of extra threads here. It will still leave you 13 millimeters of potential preload, so about 1/2 inch of preload. So on a 350 pound spring, you could preload it 175 pounds, which would be 1/2 of a 1 inch. So plenty of preload. The inner wire diameter on both springs is identical, so it fits the shock fine. And it's very easy installation. Just you know what, before we slip it on, just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and weigh the two and see what you save in weight, if anything, by going to the 350 pound spring. So let's put the new spring on and see how many threads we have, or the length, the number, not the number of threads per se, but the actual distance on the shock body that we're able to preload this. All right, so that's just taking the slack up so that the spring, I'm not adding preload, I'm just touching it right there. So let's get another measurement and we'll see how many threads are left to preload the spring. That's right at 70 millimeters. So we take the 70 plus the 19 for the spring preload adapters, and we're at 89 millimeters. We had a total of 105 millimeters. So we have 16 millimeters of preload range. So we can actually preload this shock more than a ½ inch. Let's see, 16 millimeters. Would be 0.63 inches. So roughly 5/8 of an inch you could preload this, which times a 350 pound per inch spring would give, you could preload this 220 pounds if you needed to. So it should have plenty of range. I weigh about 155. Again, my wife is about 130. Depending on what we put in the bags and all, hopefully will turn out just right. In a minute, we'll put it on the motorcycle. We'll see what the free sag and the, and see if it looks like we're going to be in range. Okay, we're going to install the shock absorber on the RX4. You're going to need a 13 millimeter open end or socket and a 15 millimeter socket for the lower bolt of the shock absorber. That goes through the clevis into the link arm. And then the upper bolt, you're going to need a 17 millimeter socket and a 10 millimeter Allen wrench. You're going to want to Loctite both those nuts probably with a permanent Loctite such as 2701. And you're probably going to want to put something on the bodies of the bolts so that they don't corrode. I use Corband 27L. It's a aviation grade anti-seize. It's meant for bolts that are going to sit stationary. It's kind of pricey. Any good anti-seize would work. Probably even a thick grease would be okay. Okay, we'll get started. Okay, so I have the motorcycle mounted on a transmission dolly. I have the rear wheel just high enough where the shock absorber itself is at the proper length so I can slip it in there and install the bolts. We're going to go ahead and put the anti-seize on the bolts prior to installation, especially on the shouldered part. And we'll go ahead and put some Loctite on the threads. When we torque the shock, we're going to want to lower the jack stand so that the whole motorcycle's rear suspension is under compression. And that way, the first big bump you hit or the first jump you take with it, it'll already be loaded in that direction. So make sure when you torque the bolts, you have weight on the rear wheel and the frame so they're compressing the shock absorber. I'm not going to go through all the things you have to remove to get to the shock absorber. What I did is, neither one of these motorcycles have been ridden. They're brand new. I took them completely apart, lubricated everything. The rear shock, or I'm sorry, the rear swing arm bearings were completely dry, absolutely zero grease. The rear bearing where the clevis goes through, also completely dry, no grease. The other bearings, surprisingly, were pretty well greased. If somebody really wanted to see how everything is disassembled and that is done, I'd be willing to take a look at making another video, but that's really not the scope of this video. This video is how to put the new shock spring on and give it a try. See what, if the 350 pounds that I calculated turns out to be the correct spring force that we're going to want. So what we have is now a 350 pound per inch in place of a 500/700 progressive. Okay, so both nuts and bolts are in place. Like I said, you want to preload the weight on the shock absorber before you torque those bolts down. And same thing if you have the linkage or the swing arm off. So we're going to drop the stand so that the motorcycle weight is on the rear wheel and on the rear shock. And then we'll go ahead and torque the bolts down. We're going to torque the lower one to 36 foot-pounds and the upper one to 40 foot-pounds. And that's a straight conversion out of the manual. The manual lists them in Newton meters, and I simply converted them to foot-pounds. So 36 for the 10 millimeter upper and 40 for the 12 millimeter lower. First we'll snug them down and then we'll go ahead and torque them. Now one other item, the nuts go on the right side of the motorcycle and the heads of the bolts feed through the left side. And that's the lower one. All right, that's about it. I'll get back to you with some sag numbers after I get the motorcycle reinstalled, and we'll get a little review of how it rides with the new spring. And then if it works out well, if people are interested, I can have you contact me, and if people want these springs, I could see what it would cost to get a handful of them made if there's some demand for them. Spring is it's the best modification you can make to this motorcycle. The rear end now picks up bumps. It doesn't over control the damping, so it stays controlled when you hit a square edge or an embedded rock, and it just makes the overall chassis and ride much better. So I would highly advise going to the softer spring if you have the opportunity to.